Russia's war machine, once sold as modern and formidable, is now in a profound crisis, centered on its most critical asset, armored vehicles. The symbol of Russian doctrine, the thunderous massed advance, has been dismantled on Ukraine's battlefields. What began as mechanized confidence devolved into a scramble for derelict Soviet hardware. This isn't just logistics, it's a breakdown of Russia's preferred way of war, a reckoning with consequences beyond the front, rot born of corruption and neglect, exposing stockpiles as hollow illusion. In early 2022, Russian armor crossed the border with confidence, a modernized armored fist, T-72B3, T-80BVM, T-90M, BMPs, and BTRs, thousands active, over 10,000 in reserve. Doctrine promised a swift, decisive blow, numbers plus tech for rapid victory, but tight columns proved vulnerable to ambush. Highways became killing fields, javelin, NLAW, logistics faltered, stranded and dry, artillery finished the job. The blitzkrieg failed. Russia pivoted to attrition, mass artillery and armor to grind defenses. Frontal assaults bled men and machines for meters. Russia became victim to its own attrition. Losses outstripped plans. Reserves tapped early. Failed offensives left tank graveyards. Drones made the battlefield transparent. Targets updated in real time. FPV drones became precision tank killers. Crews fought in full view and paid for it. Spearheads turned to coffins. Best crews and kit burned away. A 20th century mindset met 21st century war and broke. The invasion's initial phase obliterated Russia's most advanced armor. Modern T-72s and prized T-90s were systematically dismantled, forcing a desperate pivot. With its premier assets burning, the Kremlin looked backwards to its ghost fleets, a colossal forgotten arsenal of Soviet-era armor left to decay for decades. Suddenly, obscure locations like the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base were reawakened. The silence of decades was shattered as these vast graveyards were ordered to send forth their dead. These were sprawling cities of armored vehicles, waiting for a call that was never supposed to come, activated to plug the gaping holes in Russia's combat formations. And so, they began to roll out. T-62s and even older, T-55s, designs from the 1950s. These were Cold War relics, with simple steel armor offering no defense against modern missiles. Their primitive optics made them obsolete. The hope of a simple resurrection quickly evaporated. Process became a brutal exercise in industrial triage, as engineers decided which were runners, which were organ donors, and which were simply scrap metal. Even operational tanks were fitted with crude, welded-on screens, nicknamed cope cages. A desperate attempt to counter drone-dropped munitions. These were not an innovation, but a symbol of technological regression, an admission that Russia's armor was vulnerable to cheap commercial drones. The sheer scale of this effort is confirmed by satellite imagery. Before and after images of bases like Bogdanovo are stark. Where once there were hundreds of tanks, there are now vast empty spaces and disorganized carcasses. This is the reality of the process, rampant cannibalization. To get one tank running, crews must strip parts from 3, 4, or even 5 other vehicles, hunting for anything usable. Decades of exposure means rubber seals perished, wiring corroded, and electronics fried. Compounding this is a legacy of corruption. Many vehicles were quietly stripped of valuable components long ago. The official ledgers listed thousands of tanks in reserve. On paper, the depth seemed limitless. In reality, it was a fraction of the official count. Even more modern tanks in storage, like the T-80s, were found in abysmal condition. Their powerful but finicky gas turbine engines are vulnerable to long-term storage, and reports indicated most had critical failures before any repair work could even begin. The entire concept of Russia's strategic depth, its supposed ability to absorb immense losses and regenerate its forces from a vast reserve, was exposed as an illusion. It was a Potemkin village built not of painted facades, but of rusting steel. The numbers on the page were a fantasy, the reality was a scrap heap. In the brutal calculus of modern warfare, the numbers tell the most unforgiving story. For Russia's armored forces, it's a simple, devastating equation. Production is being catastrophically outpaced by losses. This isn't speculation, it's a reality meticulously documented and verified. Open-source intelligence groups, like the renowned Oryx project, have confirmed the destruction or capture of thousands of Russian main battle tanks and tens of thousands of other armored vehicles. Their methodology is conservative. counting only losses backed by verifiable photographic or video evidence. The sheer volume of documented wreckage paints a picture of staggering destruction on an industrial scale. Meanwhile, official estimates from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense push these totals significantly higher. While these figures may serve a propaganda purpose, the undeniable truth lies somewhere in the vast, grim space between these two datasets. Russia is bleeding armor faster than it can possibly replace it. To understand the depth of this crisis, we must look at Russia's premier production lines. At the Uralvagonzavod factory, the heart of Russian tank manufacturing, the nation can produce approximately 250 of its most advanced T-90M ProRiv tanks per year. These are new-build vehicles, the best in their arsenal. Similarly, the Kurganmash Zavod plant can roll out between 400 to 500 new BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles annually. Combined, this represents the peak of Russia's capacity for producing its most modern armored platforms. But this output, while significant in peacetime, is a mere drop in the bucket compared to the torrent of losses on the front lines. The thousands of vehicles destroyed, damaged, or captured since 2022 completely dwarf this annual output, creating a deep and widening deficit. Faced with this unsustainable attrition, Moscow turned to its only remaining option: the vast, decaying reserves of the Soviet Union. This triggered a frantic pull from enormous open-air storage depots, the so-called tank graveyards that litter the Russian landscape. On paper, these reserves seem bottomless, with thousands of tanks and armored vehicles waiting to be called into service. But the reality is far grimmer. Decades of exposure to harsh weather, systemic corruption, and cannibalization for spare parts have left most of these vehicles as little more than rusted-out hulls. Military analysts estimate that for every 3 vehicles dragged from these boneyards, only 1 is realistically salvageable and can be refurbished for combat. And refurbishment is a slow, costly process. It involves stripping the vehicle down, overhauling the engine and transmission, and fitting it with new electronics and optics, if they are even available. This effort consumes immense industrial resources, creating a secondary bottleneck that further strains the war economy. The consequences of this industrial failure became starkly visible on the battlefield by the summer of 2025. A notable trend emerged: a reduction in Russian armored losses. But this wasn't a sign of improved tactics or survivability. It was a symptom of scarcity. There were simply fewer armored vehicles left to lose. Russian commanders, acutely aware of their dwindling stocks, were forced to conserve their precious armor, holding it back for only the most critical moments, a decisive breakthrough or a desperate defense. Large-scale armored assaults became a costly luxury of the past, replaced by infantry-centric attacks. Ultimately, the limitations of the factory floor now dictate the strategies on the battlefield. It is a losing numbers game, and its impact is visible in every sector of the front. The war of attrition is a war of industry, and Russia's is failing the test. Desperation spawned mass refurbishments and hybrids, Franken vehicles and retrofits on aging hulls, wrecks sold for scrap, an unspoken admission of defeat, price tags on burned-out steel. Even mounted cavalry reappeared, swift but unarmored. On drone-dominated fields, it was suicidal. Ukraine fused intelligence and drones at scale. Modern ATGMs punished exposed armor. FPVs struck weak spots for a fraction of the cost. A killing web outpaced Russia's rigid command. Improvised cages failed against precision hits. A high-tech David unmade a steel Goliath. Mechanized power, dismantled piece by piece. The army that invaded Ukraine in February 2022 no longer exists. That force, the culmination of 2 decades of post-Soviet military reform, was built around professional contract soldiers equipped with Russia's most advanced tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. It was designed for a swift, decisive victory. What remains today is a ghost of that ambition. A hollowed-out force, reconstituted with waves of poorly trained, mobilized men, fighting a war of attrition its planners never envisioned. This new army is defined by what it has lost. Catastrophic armor losses forced a fundamental shift. Without protection, infantry are the primary tool for assault, often in exposed waves. To fill the gaps, Russia pulls antiquated equipment from storage. T-62 tanks, designs from the 1950s, are thrown onto a modern battlefield. These museum pieces, lacking modern optics or armor, fail predictably under the strain of combat. The result is strategic paralysis. The capacity for deep combined arms breakthroughs has evaporated. Instead, the conflict has devolved into a brutal war of position, echoing World War I. The front lines are vast networks of trenches and minefields. Progress is measured in meters, not kilometers, and comes at an appalling human cost. This is a grim contest of mass and attrition. There is no quick fix. Rebuilding this force will be the work of a generation. Western sanctions have severed access to critical high-tech components, microchips, quality optics, and precision tools. Endemic corruption and industrial inefficiency mean Russia's domestic base cannot fill the void. The result is a reliance on lower-tech solutions and parts from partners like Iran, locking in a technological disadvantage for years. But the most devastating losses are human. The experienced, professional soldiers, NCOs and junior officers who form the Army's backbone are gone. These individuals carry institutional knowledge and make smart decisions under fire. You cannot mass-produce a veteran tank commander. Their loss has created a crisis of leadership and competence at the tactical level, a void that will take decades to refill. This conventional weakness forces a dangerous pivot. Unable to win a symmetric fight, Russia leans on asymmetric tools. We see a massive pivot to low-cost systems like FPV drones and Lancet loitering munitions to substitute for artillery. Simultaneously, it relies on its arsenal of long-range standoff weapons, cruise and ballistic missiles, to strike deep into Ukraine. These fires fill gaps, left by a degraded ground force, but do so dangerously. This new reality is forcing a doctrinal reckoning. Infantry-centric tactics born of desperation risk hardening into official doctrine. The pre-war illusion of Russia's endless Soviet stockpiles is shattered. The vast tank graveyards were not arsenals in waiting, but fields of rusted scrap. The viable equipment has been consumed at a ferocious rate. Russia is now forced to fight the war it not the war it. Ultimately, the war in Ukraine is a brutal, real-world audit of Russian military power. The outcomes on the battlefield will not only decide a nation's fate, but will redraw the global map of military influence. For allies and adversaries alike, the lessons are stark. The myth of the Russian bear has been replaced by the reality of a hollowed-out force, one that will shape regional security for decades to come.